Good evening, everyone. It is really an honor to see you all here tonight. And so thank you for making the time to join us for a day of remembrance. And before I begin with the introductions, I just also want to reciprocate the thank you to Patty for opening the California Historical Society for this event and for seeing this as an opportunity. So she's the catalyst behind this program. So when you see her walking around tonight, please thank her for all of her hard work. So. And I also want to thank you for attending and being here this evening. I think it's pretty safe to say that we are experiencing unprecedented times culturally and politically. And it's obvious that change and tolerance is going to have to come from within the community, from regular people in big numbers. And so whether your family was personally affected by the camps, or you're here as an ally and supporter, it seems like this is the kind of group that would never want to let something like the camps or an exclusion or a registry ever happen again. So thank you just for showing up and for being a part of that resistance. And everyone on this panel here has a link to the camps as well, usually by way of parents or grandparents. And through their profession, artistry, or activism, they've continued to solidify the memory of the incarceration for the community, which is also bringing healing and catharsis through their work. So first we have Dr. Satsuki Ina. She is an author, activist, a film producer, and a psychotherapist specializing in the effects of trauma and specifically how the camps affected people psychologically throughout the years, particularly children. She has produced the films Children of the Camps and From a Silk Cocoon, and recently appeared in the documentary And Then They Came for Us. And she's also on the board of the Tule Lake Committee, which is where her parents were held and where she was born. Linda Tomoko Mihara is an award-winning origami artist whose work has been featured globally. Her clients include Pixar, Chanel, Industrial Light and Magic, Louis Vuitton, Disney, Mitsubishi, and I know there's a ton others. In 2015, Mayor Edley awarded Linda with the Asian Pacific American Heritage Award for her work in origami design and for her contributions to the Asian Pacific American community. And as if that wasn't keeping her busy enough, she also manages the Papertree store right here in San Francisco's Japantown, and that is her family business, and this year they're celebrating their 50th year, so it's quite an accomplishment. Kurt Kurosaki is the JACL president of the San Benito County and preserver of the local Japanese American history in San Juan Bautista, where there was quite a large farming community before the war. And as he'll explain in his presentation, only a fraction of those families returned. And aside from this, Kurt could also be considered a Renaissance man of sorts. He's a prolific electronic musician and a producer and an author, so he's quite talented. And lastly, performing a song inspired by a Teisaku interview will be Go Nakamura, a songwriter, composer, producer, and occasional actor. He was the lead in a film series called Surrogate Valentine, and his musical compositions have been featured in the films American Gangster, Feast of Love, and Body of Lies? Okay, oh, sorry. I think I messed that one up. Anyway, yes, with those two. The protagonist of the Teisaku story sadly could not make it, but his son and daughter-in-law are here, so later maybe I can introduce them if they don't mind. And finally, hosting our amazing Japanese-inspired reception is Kristen Eriko Posner, but she's upstairs right now. And her lifestyle company, Nourish, helps people adapt unique cultural traditions for our modern lives while keeping the essence of the original meaning. Kristen hosts tours of San Francisco's Japantown and writes about holidays, food, and the Japanese and Jewish American experience. So with that, I will turn it over to Satsuki Ina.
Good evening. Thank you for being here tonight. We have a limited amount of time, so I want to share with you three subjects. One is to answer the question, what is trauma? And then secondly, what happened to the Japanese Americans during World War II? And then three, briefly address the issue of how this particular trauma has been transmitted to subsequent generations. The Day of Remembrance is actually February 19th, when the executive order that put us in the prison camps was signed by Franklin Roosevelt. And in my field, in psychology, being able to remember and acknowledge the trauma itself is part of our healing. So every year we have this opportunity to educate other people, to speak amongst ourselves, to make commitments, to educate others, particularly in this political climate, about how what happened to us could happen again. And urging Japanese Americans in particular to speak up and stand out, because it is our legacy that unconstitutional incarceration, mass incarceration of Japanese Americans is being threatened as a possibility again. So, what is trauma? Trauma is defined as a event or experience that is outside of the range of normal human experience. It is an overwhelming threat, so that one's normal coping capacity is overwhelmed, and there is a normal response of fight, flight, and freeze. If there is a single threatening event, the outcomes are more likely to be successfully dealt with. In some cases, the experience of the Japanese American is an example of chronic trauma, day after day, of being denied their civil rights, living in circumstances of prison, confine. And chronic trauma has an effect on the nervous system, on the family system, and on the community. So we often talk about collective historical trauma. Our entire community on the West Coast was given sometimes 48 hours to pack up their things, to get rid of their belongings, and board a bus or truck to be sent off to an unknown destination for an indeterminate period of time. There was no access to our civil liberties. There was no conviction or trial or any crime that had been committed, except that we looked like the enemy. So victims of trauma, particularly collective trauma, where the whole community is incarcerated, will experience symptoms, and typically symptoms of anxiety or depression. So what happened to the Japanese Americans, there were 120,000 people ultimately that lost their careers, their homes, their farms, their belongings, their pets, their friends. But they also lost something that isn't quite as visible, which is their dignity, their self-efficacy, their trust in their government. There was a tremendous sense of shame, even though being innocent, being incarcerated and held for some people up to 4.5 years. And that had a lasting effect on people even after they were released, because the pressure after we'd been incarcerated for no just reason other than our race made the anxiety very intense about returning back to the community and not knowing when someone could blow the whistle again and say, you know, you're going to be incarcerated again. So even after the camps, and I've interviewed many former incarcerees, and some of them have said to me that life after camp was even worse because it became more unpredictable. There was a lot of hostility when we were released because people had lost sons and daughters, fathers, and saw our face as the face of the enemy. And so it was very difficult for people to get jobs. There was a lot of prejudice and discrimination in the schools. People wouldn't rent to people who were coming back into the city. And farms had been lost for the most part. So people had to start from scratch with a tremendous pressure to be 110% good American. And consequences of that was a pressing family dynamic, particularly of passing on this anxiety to the next generation. So the pressure to be the best student in school, to absolutely not commit any kind of crime, not cause any kind of trouble, to be the perfect citizen, and strive, this tremendous pressure to achieve. So, you know, people have written about the Japanese American community post-war and said, you know, we're an amazing group of people who have pulled themselves up by the bootstraps, and look how successful they are. They're doctors and lawyers and nurses and teachers and professionals galore. But underneath that so-called success was the underlying fear that our future was unpredictable, and that this need to overachieve was the message that was passed on to the next generation as well. The other part that I think has really slowed down the process of healing for our Japanese American community is because two major things. One was the government really actively distorted what they were doing to us. They used euphemistic language that hid the truth of what was happening. You know, they didn't call it mass incarceration without due process of law. They said that they were relocating us, that we were being evacuated, that we were a pioneer community. On the posters that were posted all over Japantown in San Francisco and all up and down the West Coast, they referred to the people that were going to be evacuated were aliens and non-aliens. So a non-alien is a citizen, but that language, that distortion of the language continued all the way through the incarceration period and justification afterwards. So the word we were relocated is an example of the way in which, even as victims of the traumatic experience, we internalize as a community the message that the government gave us. This is for your own good. This is not so bad. You are doing this as a loyal act, and this is the part that you could contribute to our success in the war. So, as victims, you know, when you're incarcerated and you're a prisoner and have lost all your power and ability to direct your future, the incredible presence of the perpetrator. And I use that term because that is a good way to describe that we were victims and there was a perpetrator. And the perpetrator defined our experience in a way that many of us, my parents included, internalized what was happening to us. So the word trauma wasn't applied to the Japanese American experience for decades. It's only in the last 10 years that that term has been used. And I've spoken to many people who said, well, camp, it wasn't so bad. And some people even say they had fun in camp. And they talk about, you know, being able to go to dances and have parties and meet their love of their life. And the way I respond to that is, if you had a good time in camp, it's not because you were incarcerated. It's not because the government made it fun for you. It's because your parents protected you from the ugliness of what was really happening to the entire family. The elders and people like my parents who had 2 babies in camp had a tremendous amount of anxiety about their future. My mother wrote in her diary, I wonder if today's the day they're going to line us up and shoot us. So to minimize the degree to which we were not only deprived of our civil rights, but the degree to which we were traumatized is really important to understand, because when people today start talking about, we just need a registry of Muslims that are coming into our country, because that's how it starts. You collect the information and it sets up the infrastructure to then eventually conduct another mass incarceration. And like many trauma victims, silence was one of the coping mechanisms that was very typical in our families. So people will say that they tried to find out from their parents what they experienced. It's not uncommon for a trauma victim to compartmentalize and shut down the emotional aspect of that experience. But I think the way in which the narrative was written and imposed by the government and the need to fit back into American society reinforced the suppression of the story. Lost track of time. So, people have asked, can trauma be passed on? Is it possible that, so I'm a therapist and have seen families, Japanese American families, dealing with the long-term effects of incarceration, and the question often comes up and says, I wasn't in camp, but I'm wondering if what's going on for me is related to the fact that my parents and grandparents were in camp. They never talked about it, and yet I know that something happened, something it's like a family secret that's held, creates anxiety for the person. So there's many ways in which we can understand how that trauma gets transmitted. And the psychosocial aspect of it is if the parents or somebody teaches or talks to the person about what camp life is like, read a book, then they could learn more. They could observe the behavior of their parents. For example, my father never answered the phone because he didn't feel his English was good enough, and that whoever was calling, even if it was somebody selling encyclopedias, he would feel ashamed of his inability to speak proper English. And so we would watch that, see that kind of behavior, and internalize this sense of not fitting in or being less than. So we witnessed this anxious behavior of our parents, and the overachieving. These are escape behaviors to not address the vulnerability that we feel from having lost all of our rights. And here's the other part, because this was, people in America talk often about how horrible the Nazis were to the Jews. But very few people talk about the horrible thing that America did to their own people. So, can be transmitted, the feeling, the anxiety level can be transmitted by observing and listening and reading and feeling the message that's conveyed by the parents, which is, this is not a safe place. You have to earn your value. You have to do more than what's expected of you in order to be accepted. So these coping mechanisms interfere with the actual evolution or evolving nature of who that person is, because they're always watching to see if they're doing the right thing. One of the saddest tragedies that I know of is in my generation, we have lots of doctors, lawyers, teachers, nurses, some attorneys, but we don't have a lot of musicians, artists, performers, actors, because those were fields that didn't qualify in our community as being successful or as being the way to solidify our place in America. We had to be going to the best colleges, getting the highest degrees. And there's a price that we paid, because many people who had those kinds of gifts and talents had to put those aside. A very common other aspect that you see that could get passed on by observing and learning is low risk-taking behavior. That to conform and belong and not take risks was another way of keeping a low profile, and supported somewhat by Japanese values too, of not causing any kind of disruption or disturbance. It's also become clear there's a lot of hoarding behavior of former incarcerees. Fear, and we make a joke about this, about how we save all of our kamaboko boards and our broccoli rubber bands, and feel that you never know when you might need these things. I think is a direct outgrowth of our prison camp experience. So trauma can get passed on by learning and observing. It also can be passed on physiologically. And there's tremendous research right now called epigenetics, where people are looking at the ways in which trauma affects the chemistry in the body that actually then can be passed on to the next generation. I just want to quickly read this one section. This is what they're saying today. Trauma leaves visible and invisible marks, not only on survivors, but also on their children. Victims may have been marked epigenetically with a chemical coating upon their chromosomes, which would represent a kind of biological memory of what the parents experienced. As a result, some suffer from a general vulnerability to stress, while others are more resilient. So this is a very exciting field of study that will help us understand not just the psychosocial manifestation, but also a genetic link to ways in which we cope and survive. So there are some protective factors for the Japanese American community grounded in our Japanese value system. And they have supportive effects as well as, and protective effects that also contributed to the long-term effects of the incarceration experience. So we're a culture that is values community. It's not an individualistic, but more a community-oriented culture, where harmony in relationships is highly valued. And so it presses for conformity and also silence. Silence so that if someone's pissing you off, you keep your mouth shut and things will go smoother. Also, filial piety, the fact that we're raised to respect our elders and authority and not protest, helped us survive, but also has supported our suppression of the trauma that we experience. Another value is kodomo no tameni, which is for the sake of the children, that parents will sacrifice their own well-being for the sake of the children. And many elders have told me that that's why they never talked to their children about their experience in camp, because they didn't want to burden the children with the anger and the suffering that they had borne themselves. But we also know that that kind of silence creates anxiety in the next generation. shikataganai, it means it can't be helped. So this is kind of the fatalist value system that there's nothing we can do about it, so we just need to go with the flow. That value made it very difficult to be a protester in the prison camp. That if you protested and caused problems, you were viewed as a troublemaker and somebody that was working against the benefit of the community. And then the last one is called gaman, which is a value of the strength in silence. Someone who can gaman is considered strong because they're able to endure whatever suffering comes their way. So I'm just going to close by saying, we have a lot of unfinished business still. And there are many of us that feel that today's political climate is calling on us for our healing. And our healing is going to come from using our voice to speak out today in ways we couldn't speak out back when we were incarcerated and shortly thereafter. So that's one of the reasons I'm here with you today, is to use my voice to educate and share the story, because it's for my own healing as well. So thank you for being here.
I am honored to be included in with this program this evening. Being a fourth generation, or a Yonsei, I think it's my story in connection to DOR is a little bit different. I consider it more after the future, what's happening now with the kids of parents, grandparents, great-grandparents that were interned. Every year during the DOR, I go back and think about my family's experience and how I am so fortunate and lucky to be living in this time and having known my grandparents and great-grandparents that have lived with grace and taught me nothing but positivity, and that you can do anything you want. What a wonderful gift to be given. I grew up in San Francisco, born and raised. My great-grandparents, my grandparents, my father, and my uncle were all interned at Heart Mountain, Wyoming. And my dad was 8 years old, and I've only heard stories from his perspective, and being a child, he considered it like going to camp. What they did with a lot of the kids was, in particular the boys, and here's my family portrait of my grandma and grandpa who are standing in the back. The two boys in front of my grandpa are my dad and my uncle. Then I have my two aunts and one uncle. This was taken before the war, obviously, and I believe shortly after that, maybe about 5 years after that, is when they went to internment. My grandfather was a scholar. He graduated from Waseda University in Japan, was very educated. When they were in San Francisco, he actually was the editor of the first Japanese-American newspaper called the New World Sun. When the internment happened, they were assembled at, in Japantown, there was the Golden Gate University, which was the Japanese language school, where all the families in the San Francisco Nihonmachi, or the Japantown area, were sent. They boarded buses to go to Tanforan, and from there, my family boarded one of the trains that went to Heart Mountain, Wyoming. As you know, that was the point from which a lot of Japanese either went to Manzanar or Topaz. They went all the way up to Heart Mountain, and I remembered he would tell me that they had the shades drawn while they were riding on the train, so they didn't get to see where they were going until they went to the Heart Mountain. Years later, I got to go with my parents, with my mom as well, to Heart Mountain. They opened an interpretive center, and that was the first time I got to see Um, and, you know, what the area they were living in, I can't imagine the conditions that must have happened during, you know, the winter time. And my dad would say, you know, there's sagebrush all around and there's nothing else really growing around there. And so what the community had to do was actually become self-sufficient. They had a dairy, they grew their own food and vegetables, and really helped provide food for a lot of the other camps, I find out later, which was really amazing. So I get to revisit that. I get to revisit the conditions in which they were living. The stories from my father, he would say the guards would actually let them go under the barbed wire to go to fish in the stream. And one day, one of his friends actually was drowning, was in trouble. My dad actually saved his life. And then they gathered their stuff and came back under the fence and got to go and be boys in this camp. I know the stories for the adults were a lot different. And as Dr. Ina pointed out, the mental challenges must have been great. But my grandparents never shared that part of it with me or my sister or my brother. I just learned by how my grandfather lived, and I want to introduce my grandfather as one of the key people in my life that was responsible for who I am today. As I mentioned before, he was a scholar, and let's see if I'm going the right way. Maybe I'll go this way. Okay, that's Grandpa. In camp, he had glaucoma. He didn't have the proper medical care while he was there, and subsequently lost his sight. In the later days when the sight was almost gone, I remembered he had written in one of his other books, he wrote like 9 books, and he was describing how it looked like the window was just closing in on him, and his last visions were that of camp. I can't even imagine that being the last thing you see. He never really said and never shared how traumatic or what a horrible experience he had. He just went forward and lived his life and went on to do amazing things. One of them was the beginning of what you see there, the first English-Japanese dictionary. Now, if you can imagine writing a dictionary, English-Japanese translation, he would dictate that to a secretary. The definitions of the words start with A, he'd just go through and actually created this dictionary over years. When they got out of camp, they couldn't move back to San Francisco for, I'm not exactly sure what the reasons were, but he couldn't come back to San Francisco. The family couldn't come back to San Francisco. So they settled in Salt Lake City. And there is where Grandpa continued to write books. He also started the Oriental Culture Book Company, which produced these books. And which, when they came back to San Francisco, so that was between 1945 and 48, they were in Salt Lake City. Came back to San Francisco, and they were able to live back in the house that they were living in before the war. So this is a picture of my grandpa Tonobu Mihara with his guide dog Vanny. And you know, he was a great grandpa. We would take walks up to the park every day, and of course, you know, walking the dog too with him was really a lot of fun. And it was, you know, so growing up was like, I didn't feel any negativity. It was just all, you know, how can we make our lives better? How can you be happy doing what you're doing? How can you accomplish things? And really, you know, he led by example, and he taught me that if you're blind, if you have any kind of a handicap, that's not going to stop you from accomplishing what you really want to do. And I think that was like the most important message that I learned from him. While he was in camp, he actually created a system of Braille. Just unbelievable. You know, his accomplishments were just amazing. He had at this time he lost his sight, and there was one of his friends in camp that actually fashioned this beautiful board that had the Braille characters. and which is actually part of the Art of Gaman exhibit that is, I don't know if it's being shown right now, but there is an exhibit called the Art of Gaman, and it contains all of the art that was created in camp, and this was actually one of the things that was part of that exhibit. And they had nothing in camp, but yet he was still able to have his friend do this beautiful piece of work. And there are many other pieces of work in this exhibit too. And I have the book. You're welcome to look at that as, you know, to see the other works of art that were in there. So now we're back in San Francisco, and we're in front of the house on Sutter Street. Behind my grandma in the middle, on the door, it says Oriental Culture Book Company. And that's where my grandpa, that's where we had our company. So grandparents lived on the top 2 floors. This was an amazing, beautiful Victorian house. We lived on the bottom floor. In the back, there was a full-size gymnasium that was used as the warehouse because my grandpa also had started the import business of Oriental culture. He also had magazine subscriptions that he would send out. So we would get these shipments of books in, magazines, gifts, and then they would go be sent out to all the different people that had subscriptions, and then also the different Japanese gift businesses that were all around the country. And so that's my brother, my sister, and myself there. Now, in 1974, Japantown was going through a redevelopment. I'm sorry, not 74, 68. In the Japantown area, we were going through a big redevelopment at 8 blocks. And they had approached my grandparents who were living in this house and said, this house falls within the redevelopment area, so you have the choice of either bringing the house up to code or having property on Buchanan Mall. Let's fast forward just a little bit after that. My dad, because he was traveling a lot as a buyer for the Oriental culture business, he didn't want to travel anymore. So when the Japan Center was built, he decided to, and my grandparents too, they decided to close the Oriental Culture Book Company and open Paper Tree. And so here we are standing in front of the Paper Tree, which was originally in the East Building of the Japan Center. And my sister and I, and Rod, who was one of the workers at the time. And if you look behind us, there's some, fancy keychains. I think there's like a peace symbol back there. I mean, we're talking 68. I mean, it was really fun. And you see the flower sticker on the register there. And my dad's cool haircut. My crazy pants. That's my sister in the yellow vest. Then my mom. Oh yeah, it's great. It was I was really happy to see these. This is what the store looked like inside. It was great. We did primarily books. We had a lot of the books still left from Oriental culture, and had my grandpa also was the first to import packaged origami paper. He also authored 2 of the first books in English on origami, which I also have, so you're welcome to look at that too. So I've been doing origami since I was 5 years old, so I'll talk about that later. Let me just finish about Paper Tree. So my mom, if you look there behind the counter, just really, I love this picture because you look at the customer and look at what she's wearing, and look at the other picture, what she's wearing. I mean, you have that, I don't have any of the hippies with the long hair in here, but they've made their way through too. When we were in the Japan Center, when you have a retail business, what's really fun, and especially in a place like Japantown, there are all kinds of tourists and everything like that. I should just go back to this picture. Okay, so while we were there in the Japan Center, there was 2 blocks down, there was a place called, it was called Winterland before it closed. Bill Graham had a lot of concerts there. Before that, it was the Ice Capades had a thing there, but it had, in the later years, it had, it was Winterland. They sponsored a lot of rock and roll concerts, and they all stayed at the Miyako Hotel in the Japan Center. And one day, guess who walks into the store? I was 11 years old, John Lennon and Yoko Ono. I said, that's John, that's Yoko, OMG. I was terrified. So my mom and dad, they were talking to them. I'm like, and I was a big autograph hound too, because I had Clarence, the doorman at the Miyako, would always tell me who was staying there, so he'd tell me to come back at 5 o'clock and come and get an autograph. But this time, John Lennon and Yoko walk into the store, and I'm like, I gotta get their autograph, right? I was terrified, I couldn't say anything to them. So what happened was, they left the store, they bought some postcards and left the store. I don't know if you know any of the history of the Beatles. After they broke up, they would send postcards to each other. I don't know if you know that. There was a book that was produced, and so I'd like to think that some of the postcards that John bought at our store would make it to to Paul or Ringo, which is kind of fun. And this was a time when they spent a month away from the public eye. They came to Japantown, they were there for a whole week, nobody bothered them, there was no press around, there were no crowds of people, there were no people taking pictures, it was really great. And what was really cool was that they were really nice people. And so I had my autograph book, I said, I gotta get their autographs, so off I go, I follow them, they walk through the entire Japan Center, and I'm following them like 30 feet behind, hiding behind this door, hiding behind that part, and then they walk all the way down to the end of the Japan Center, and then they reach the end, and now they're coming back. So now I'm following them, they're coming back, and I'm going, it's now or never. I know they're going back to the hotel, I gotta ask them. So right in the middle of the plaza there, I tap him on the shoulder, and I said, Mr. Lennon, may I have your autograph? I hold out my autograph book, which actually was very 60s in style. It had all these daisies on it and everything like that. And my pen, and he says, oh, why certainly, darling, how lovely. So he starts writing his autograph, and then he hands it to Yoko, and he goes, Yoko, could you sign this for the young lady? So she signs it. So we're talking, there's nobody around. I'm like, ugh. So he starts asking me, he says, so what do you want to be when you grow up? What do you want to study in school? And I said, I really don't know. He says, whatever you do, be happy doing what you're doing. Now, that didn't make any sense to an 11-year-old kid. I was like, what does that mean? I don't understand. When I became an adult, that kicked in. I live my life like that. Do what makes you happy. And that was like, he's the other influential person that I've met in my life that really made an impact. So my grandpa and John Lennon. What a contrast, right? So then in '74, we had the opportunity to either bring the house up to redevelopment standards or have first crack at the property on Buchanan, which was being redone. And my dad chose to do that and have our building there and be outside of the Japan Center, so it was great. So here's some opening shots. That's my brother with my parents. And then in the color picture there's my sister and I, and then her dog. Oops. And then, so this is what some of the things that we have inside. Now, if you look at the picture on your left, in the back, you see those wooden crates? When we had the Oriental Culture Book Company, all the magazines and goods used to come to the store, or come to the warehouse in the wooden crates. That's how they used to ship things. So some of these crates, which we have in their store right now, are just like 60 years old. It's really kind of cool to see them. So we have books and origami and lots of beautiful paper and wonderful origami galleries and great stuff. And that's paper trade. Having a business in Japantown, this is our 50th anniversary, there's only like 4 family runs still remaining here in Japantown, and I feel honored that I can carry on the tradition of this business. Being in Japantown, having more Japanese-themed things, like we have a very large selection of origami paper and books, and Japanese art supplies, and to be able to participate in the big festival every year, which is the Cherry Blossom Festival, and that's something that we actually do origami for, and we have since the beginning. So I'm really looking forward to the next 50 years. I think it's a great place to be, and I just hope that all of you will live your life like what John Lennon says, whatever you do, be happy. Thank you very much.
All right, good evening, everyone. I've been informed that seconds to my name is Kurt Kurosaki, and I live in San Juan Bautista. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with my little town, it's about 100 miles south of here. It sits on the corner of San Benito County, Monterey County, Santa Cruz County, and Santa Clara County. It's home of Mission San Juan Bautista, which has been around for a couple hundred years. The inside population is about 1,700 people, but the whole area has about 6,000 or 7,000 residents, and its primary industry is agriculture and tourism. But so what I'm really here to talk about is food, because so much of the food that gets shipped out to the country comes from San Juan Bautista. This is an image of the State Historic Park. And for those of you who still don't know anything about this little town, it's most famous for the film Vertigo. And that's Kim Novak and Alfred Hitchcock setting up a scene right outside, right in front of the mission. So about 200 yards west of the mission grounds is this building, which was built in 1935 by a Japanese immigrant population in San Juan Bautista. At that time, there were probably about 400 or 500 Japanese farm labor immigrants in the town. They'd come and replaced all of the Chinese immigrants. In the early 1900s, there were about 600 Chinese immigrants and only about 90 Japanese immigrants. Then the exclusion laws were established, and then the Chinese population started to dwindle and was replaced by the Japanese immigrants, who were primarily there for farm labor. So the Japanese community decided to set up, they saw that these alien land laws were being enacted and the exclusion orders were being enacted, and they thought, we're only here temporarily, we're going to go back to Japan. We're going to be sent back to Japan. So they built this school so that they could teach their children about the ways of Japan and the language. In 1935, when the building was erected, they also established a chapter of the Japanese American Citizens League, which is a nationwide organization. I don't know if I should get any details, but we've got our San Francisco representative, Haruka Rodebush, here. And it's been it's a national civil rights organization, and back then it was established as sort of a citizens' rights group. Moving on. This is a picture of San Juan Bautista. You can see the mission in the center. And then off to the left of the screen, there's a little white speck there. That's the San Juan Japanese Hall. And as you can see, everything around it is agricultural. So after the evacuation notices were sent out, the government was also sending out photographers. Most famously was Dorothea Lange. Another, probably even more prolific photographer was Russell Lee. And he was documenting the evacuation at the Santa Anita racetrack in Los Angeles. And then he was commissioned to come up to document the evacuation of the Salinas Assembly Center. And he just happened to come through San Juan Bautista and capture these images. This is actually, let me go back here. At this site here, where this is taken in the spinach field, is the location of the current Earthbound Farms. I don't know if you're familiar with the packaged salad company, but that's where this was taken in 1942. We have a little tomato patch here. And we are currently working on trying to set up an exhibit with these photos, because what happens is that these are people that we know. They came in and he photographed these school children, and it almost looks like a staged little parade with all the flags. And they're having an iron scrap metal drive to collect materials for the war effort. Running right through town. This is a pretty iconic photo in this collection from Russell Lee. That's the building on the left there is Casa Rosa, which is a building which is known for its football. It was known for its I'm drawing a blank. The significance of this photo is that this was historically, before 1935, this little section of Main Street in San Juan Bautista was a Japantown. That was a hotel that was owned by the Oka family, and then it served as like a pool hall and maybe a house with over a few, I'm not sure. But there was a tofu shop there. There was a bathhouse there, and it served the immigrant population, the Japanese immigrant population of San Juan Bautista at that time. Unfortunately, all of that is pretty much gone now. As I said before evacuation, there were probably 470 Japanese farmers, or second generation, first generation Japanese farmers. After the war, there were only 125 that returned. And currently, I think there's 5. Me, my mom, and a few others. But as I was mentioning, I've been working with Akira Bach, who is also from San Juan Bautista. He's part of the Japanese American National Museum, and he stumbled upon these photos at the Library of Congress. And this is an image of the San Juan Cemetery, and the young boys there are tending to the grave. It's a very old Shinto tradition where you take care of your ancestors. This is only a few days before they were being evacuated. And in fact, every May, on Memorial Day, we still have this tradition. We go out to the cemetery and we clean everything up and present flowers. Most of these headstones are still there, but you'll notice that some of them are wood and they've been lost. But thanks to these photographs, the resolution is so good, we're able to go in and actually identify the names of the people in these stones. As I said in the beginning, food. This was taken inside the Japanese Hall building, a few days before evacuation, and they're having a nice traditional Japanese lunch there, hot dogs and potato chips and apple pie, I believe. And as part of our project, we've been trying to go through and identify these people. And it's with some great fortune that I still have all of the minutes that date back to 1925 of all their meetings. Unfortunately, most of these people have passed on, and we're still trying to get more details. But it's amazing that we could even stumble upon these photographs. This is Sam Shingai, or Isamu. He served at the Military Intelligence Service, and he was sent to Japan during the Reconstruction to intercept or to translate Japanese mail before it left the country. These are some farmers. These are the Nishida brothers. Mr. Kawaki is second from the right. Sam's brother, Isaac, is on the far right. It becomes kind of neat that we actually are able to identify these people because these were neighbors that we knew. These were people who were fortunate enough to have held on to their land thanks to the generosity and kindness of some of their neighbors. This is a great shot. This is, like I said, this a few days before evacuation. So all of the boys brought their cars over to the hall, and they were cleaning them, waxing them, getting them all tuned up because they knew they had to take off in a few days to Salinas. In 1942, our JACL chapter was pretty well established. And this is one of the documents I have of all of the members of our chapter. And this is only the JACL group. These were young kids, 19, 20, 21, Niseis who were American citizens. So now we still have the building, and it's sort of my job to take care of it. And we have a few events there every year. We host. This is a group from Cabrillo College, their board of trustees. Fortunately, one of the professors at Cabrillo College, Sandy Biden, has written an extensive history of the Chinese and Japanese immigrants in Monterey Bay and in San Benito County. We have our annual bingo fundraiser. This is our fundraiser year. That's next week. I host a barbecue. Because just like the old photos, what this place was a communal gathering place for food and recreation. And then at the end of the year, we have our, probably our biggest event, which is a Japanese shogatsu. It's one of the traditions where you get together with your family. You go home, you visit your family, and just enjoy New Year's Day together and eat. So this is in the same kitchen from the hot dog photo, except we're just having a little sashimi. And this is the main hall there. And it's unfortunate that we weren't able to find more photos of the inside of the hall or the exterior of the hall, but Professor Biden had told me it's probably because they didn't want anyone to know where the building was. They didn't want the government to be able to identify the location of this building. Because a lot of people stored their personal possessions in this building, and they thought it's probably best not to document that. And that's it. If you have any questions, I will be around for the rest of the evening to personally answer them. Thank you very much.
I want to start my presentation with a personal anecdote about why I started Teisaku, which is an oral history project for those of you who don't know. So I'm interviewing people who survived incarceration. And this is a picture of my grandfather on the far right, my grandmother, and my dad, who is here tonight, the very handsome gentleman over there. And he's not shy, he can wave. And I want to start with saying that I barely knew my grandfather. Every memory I have of him is kind of a fragment of a dream. That's what it feels like. The one vivid memory I have is that my family and I were out at a Japanese restaurant, and I must have been about 7 or 8, and my grandfather had a stroke, and so he wasn't in his right mind, and he was kind of losing just very basic motor skills, I think. And I remember he tried to eat a plastic piece of grass that they often put on a sushi platter, and by accident, and I think he might have started choking or he was coughing. I remember my dad trying to help him. And it's sad to say that's probably the one memory I have of him being alive. And I think the most heartbreaking thing about that is that person that day was not this person. Excuse me. This person was outspoken, unapologetic, and indignant about the treatment of his family during the war. And I suppose that he willed me into doing this work, though he would have no way of knowing it would turn out that way, that this would become my passion. And now, of course, the lives and perspectives of our family who went through the camps go far beyond just that experience. And there's more depth and complexity to who they are as people. But what I have found through my project is that the incarceration and World War II changed everyone in some way. I'm not sure the people that experienced ever fully healed. I think time definitely covered the scars, but I think that that cuts pretty deep. And so, while I put my grandfather's perspective too on a pedestal, he was no angel, just to kind of make that clear, but he was not immune to the very human downfalls that perhaps even made his family suffer a little bit more, considering that he had a wife and a 5-year-old son at the time of the incarceration. So I've been collecting stories for Teisaku for 3 years now, and every story made me want to go back and resurface what was lost within our own family so that I could change the memory that I had of my grandfather. And it certainly has turned out that way because I ordered his 160 pages worth of files from the National Archives of the War Relocation Authority. So if anyone is interested in knowing how you do that, because if you have family that was incarcerated, you can buy it from them, which kind of adds insult to injury, but they will send it to you. So what I realized is that the one intact and relatively seamless story that we're always going to have is the one that came from the government. That narrative is intact. So here's an example of just a short note from Dylan S. Meyer, who was the head of the WRA, or I think it was addressed to him, but this was something concerning my grandmother, who was wondering what was going to happen to my grandfather, who had been taken away. To give some context, my grandfather had made so much ruckus in Topaz, where they first were, that they put him in a citizen isolation center in Loop, Arizona. And that just basically meant that all the unruly Japanese Americans, all men, were sent there to be isolated from the camp so as to probably not contaminate or to influence the other people there. So my grandmother here, I guess, got someone to send this note on her behalf. Another note here is his testimony. This was given in Japanese. He didn't speak English well. He was actually born in the United States, but educated in Japan. So I just want to read this, what he says here. I want to return to Japan because I do not like it in this country, and also because I have an old father back there. I have applied for repatriation and answered no to questions 27 and 28. I am willing to serve in the Japanese army and fight against the United States if ordered to do so. I do not care to state whom I would like to see win the war. So he was pretty clear about where he stood. And when my dad and I went through this, we didn't know that my grandfather had a business before, that he had this employment agency. So right, that line before says he was very bitter because they took his license away. So that was something that happened that we didn't know. So a lot has happened in between this point of March 15th when he gave his testimony and he was fired up and he was angry, and between this document, which is from the perspective of the camp directors or the camp managers. And so what they thought of him was that he had a chip on his shoulder, and that he was, like they say, oversensitive, suspicious, and aggressive. There is evidence of a persecution complex. Chip on his shoulder was very evident from the few months of his stay at Loop. However, he simmered down considerably at this writing. And then this, to me, is the part that just gets me. He made a couple of attempts to assert himself, but was outmaneuvered and lost face. He maintains that he has learned his lesson and states that if he is allowed to join his family at Tule Lake, he will cause no more trouble. So at some point, he was sort of broken into this submission to, either sign a letter that he didn't believe or to actually give this testimony. In their eyes, they were suppressing his unmanageable and un-American behavior, but that tells a one-sided story. What I've come to realize is even though my grandfather may have had sympathies with Japan as the country that he knew, his disobedience was one of the most American things that he could have done, to be so unwavering in his conviction that this was wrong. And for that, that's basically what I hope I would do in the same circumstance. I'm sure he came back from camp slightly broken and defeated, but I know that he always maintained his perspective. The only writing that we have of him is in this book called Kinenhi, which is collections from Tule Lake. And he says here is, if there had been no questionnaire, which is where they asked people to, are you loyal to the United States and will you serve in the military? If there had been no questionnaire, I don't believe there had been any trouble, especially number 27, are you loyal to Japan? I was educated in Japan. How can I say I'm not loyal to Japan? If you were educated in the US and asked in Japan if you were loyal to the US, you would too have to answer yes. I had no choice. And that's what he maintained for his whole life. And there he is with my dad before the war. I wanted to also bring up some of the other perspectives and really wonderful points that a few people have made through my interviews. This is from Nancy Yamamoto, and she's a member at the Oakland Buddhist Church. Once I was home from a girls' meeting, and I was intending to take the train back to San Francisco on Monday morning. They wouldn't allow me to get on the train. I think I can still picture him, the conductor. I said, why not? He said, your country started a war against us. And I said, that's not my country. I'm an American-born Japanese American. He said, doesn't make any difference, I can't sell you a ticket. And actually after that he said, you have to get your birth certificate, which we've heard that in recent years too. So that's how he wanted her to prove that she was born here, but I guess it didn't make a difference. She still couldn't get on the train. This is also from another woman at the Oakland Buddhist Church who was just expressing that she regretted not asking her grandfather what happened after he came back from Lordsburg, New Mexico, which was another citizen isolation center. So her grandfather experienced the same thing I think my grandfather must have experienced, and she says that he had aged so much, it was so noticeable, but I was too young to question him about what happened. This is Sherman Kishi and his wife June, and he's a farmer in Livingston, California. After they gave us redress, it really just relieved all of us who had been in camp, because camp was sort of a feeling of shame that you had to be in a place like that. But after that, we felt much more free to talk about it in person, talk about it. We need to keep it in people's minds that it did happen. And lastly, I wanted to end on an uplifting note of what good came for some people and what they've attributed positivity to due to the camps. This is Betty and Art Shibayama, and Art Shibayama actually is Japanese Peruvian. And they have quite a different story. They still never received their redress, but they were taken from Peru. And she says, well, if it didn't happen, if we weren't evacuated, I wouldn't have never met Art. From Peru to a little farm girl in Oregon, how would we meet? So I have no regrets. So I thought that was beautiful. And in my last overtime minute, I wanted to end on this photo that is of the Loop group that my grandfather experienced that citizen isolation center with. And if you can't tell who my grandfather is, just look for the most smug-looking person on the far right in a pinstripe suit. But I love this because not only of his expression, but this photo just encapsulates everything that they were deprived of in camp, which was good food that they were familiar with and wanted, and sake and beer, and their kids and their wives. And so at the time of this photo, my grandpa could have never anticipated that redress would happen, or that an apology would be given, or that he would be called upon to testify in front of the Redress Commission right here in San Francisco. But he did all of that. And he never wavered, and he never backed down from vocalizing how angry he was about the mistreatment. So in the ways that our families pass down to us many unconscious things, may we always also remember and embrace their convictions and resilience. So thank you. That's my presentation.
And I remember when I met you last year that you had told me about this idea of an event at the California Historical Society. And I knew immediately that I wanted to be part of it. I'm so honored to be here with all of you and all of our amazing speakers and panelists. I'm really happy that my wish came true. So when we met for the first time, you touched on this a little bit, but I think we both knew immediately that we were kindred spirits and that we would be friends for a long time. So we're both on this sort of journey of searching for the stories and the parts of our heritage that were lost before we were old enough to really begin collecting them. I'm Japanese American and Jewish by choice, and when I converted to Judaism, I had this sort of identity crisis. Being fourth generation Japanese American, I felt like my Japanese heritage had gotten so watered down, and that I would lose those Japanese parts of myself. But then as I studied for my conversion, I learned that there was actually space for both. Through the Jewish rituals that I learned to celebrate the seasons of the year and the cycles of life, I learned that these rituals were the exact medicine that I needed when I was in need of healing and just to give so much depth and meaning to the celebrations, celebratory times in my life. The problem, though, with ritual and tradition is that they get lost if we don't evolve them and update them as the world evolves. And it's evolving really, really quickly. So I started combining my traditions. Last year we had a Passover Seder for our friends and family with Japanese takes on classic Ashkenazi Jewish dishes, like a chicken supineh soup instead of a matzo ball soup. So yeah, there's so many different parts of my company, Nourish. You'll see some of it tonight with the food that I've prepared for you. But I also create guides and recipes for life cycle events and for holidays. For example, I did an interview recently with a hospice nurse about rituals on death and dying. And I've also written an article on modern ways to combine two rich cultural traditions into a wedding, which my husband Brian and I did. And next, I'm hosting a racial justice Passover Seder on March 30th with the Shalom. It's a Jewish community that discusses social issues over monthly Shabbat dinners. You can join my community at nourish-sf.com. And I have cards up there, and I'm really looking forward to chatting with you all and getting to know you. So what I prepared tonight are a lot of the dishes that I kind of grew up with. They have my take on them. So I have salmon musubi, so it's little salmon rice balls with sesame seeds, and dill and chives and lemon. And then I also have these cones of crudités, which are like vegetable sticks with the edamame hummus and shiokoji. And then, what else did I make? I have little chicken gyoza cups. They're sort of in the shape of a flower. And the last dish that I have is really special, and it's actually something I didn't prepare. But it's from a really, really special place here in San Francisco. If you live in San Francisco, you should definitely check this place out. If you haven't heard of it, it's called Ben Kyoto in Japantown. It's actually next door to Linda's store. And it's an amazing little shop. It's an institution. It's been there for 112 years. It was one of the very first shops. I think it's like the oldest shop in Japantown. And they make manju, which are these Japanese confections. They're like sweet bean cakes on the inside and mochi on the outside. And it's all made by this one man named Bobby, who just gets there really early and makes them all by hand. Yeah, 5 o'clock in the morning. So yeah, I hope that you enjoy them. They're really a special treat. And yeah, I won't keep you any longer from having food. Thank you so much for having me tonight, and thank you so much to Diana for letting me be a part of this.
So, to bring us into transition for our reception, Go is going to perform a song based on a gentleman, Tom Mas Inada. So I interviewed him, last year. So, and it was a great fortuitous connection that we met. And I'd like to put David and Ellen on display as she starts filming. So his son David and his daughter-in-law Ellen are sitting in the corner right there. You want to wave. So they're here on behalf of his dad, and I hope that they enjoy and can pick up all the different nuances and parts of his life. So as Go plays this really beautiful piece, there's going to be photos of him from when he was young and a couple of new ones. And I'll let Go tell the story. So hope you enjoy.
Someone's looking out for me. So many twists of fate and chance. Someone's been looking out for me. Feels more than coincidence. My name is Mas Inada. People call me Tom sometimes too. Born and raised in Sacramento in 1922, and I was dreaming of being an artist. So I enrolled at the local art school, but the war stopped my dreams when my family and me were rounded up because of our ancestry. Put on a train to a place called Tule Lake. Went from citizen to inmate in a minute of disgrace. Are you loyal to the USA? Will you fight for your country? Will you die for this place that will treat you this way? And all I've ever known was the United States. So I answered yes to 27 and yes to 28. Japan had always been a mystery. I'd be loyal to America even after what they did to me. All I ever wanted was to follow my own dreams, pursue my heart of art, draw some mountains, maybe draw some trees. And the days blurred by behind the barbed wire fence. I was lucky to get a job at the newspaper art department. I was lucky to have something to focus on, I guess. Someone was looking out for me. And then I heard there was a way to get out of Tule Lake. Thanks to the Quakers in Ohio, had a house where I could stay, find a job, place to earn my keep. It's there I met a friend who led me to New York City. I was walking down the street, I saw another friend come down. He said, "Hey there, Miles, are you looking for a job?" Animation studio just rode into town. Someone's been looking out for me. Someone's been looking out for me. So many twists of fate and chance. Someone's been looking out for me. Feels like more than coincidence. Well, I got hired drawing Popeye and Little Lulu. I even got a raise, but that good news ended soon. Got drafted by the army to serve the 442. Got sent to Mississippi for my basic training dues. When they saw I'd gone to Japanese school, I got sent to Minnesota to train in intelligence too. My friends were not so lucky, they never made it through. Someone was looking out for me. From there I'd be sent away straight to the Philippines. There was a silver lining, at the time I couldn't see. After Minnesota and a break from training school, I had 3 days in Chicago to find a girl that I once knew. Someone was looking out for me. Martha was a girl, I knew her from art school. So I looked her up and found her, but that's where fate came through. With just my luck, she had the mumps after coming all this way. She said, "Why don't you take my cousin out? Yoshiko's her name." I said, "Okay." I always get shy when I was talking to any girls, but somehow I could get along and talk so freely with her. After I got overseas, I asked if we could exchange letters to keep in touch, to keep alive this flame. I must have been a Romeo on that written page, 'cause it's through those letters that we pretty much got engaged. Someone's looking out for me. So many twists of fate and chance. Someone's looking out for me. Feels more than coincidence. And now that I can clearly see the lines that make the poem of my life, through the cloudy days and dust storms and the bending of the light, painted countless pictures, painstaking frame by frame. But my greatest works of art are those that'll carry on my name. I survived the camps, the war, the aftermath overseas. I was somehow spared from all the wickedness around me. Most of all, I was lucky to have a girl waiting for me. Someone was looking out for me.